She chose the $100M Gala, the very heart of his world. Yoon Hae-rin stood in the center of the ballroom, her shimmering gold gown catching the light like a predator's scales. She didn't whisper her betrayal, she shouted it. Yi-won sat perfectly still as her finger pointed at his chest, her voice cutting through the high society music like a blade. The elite crowd went silent. The cameras of 100 socialites turned toward them. What none of them knew, what Hae-rin, in her desperate grab for dominance, couldn't possibly imagine, was that Yi-won had been waiting for her to make this exact move. The ballroom was breathtaking that night. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the assembly of the city's most powerful families. Round tables were draped in heavy silk, topped with centerpieces of rare white orchids. A live string quartet played near the marble entrance, their music floating through the air like an expensive perfume. It looked like a triumph of high culture. It felt like one, too, at least until the first glass shattered. Han Jae-won sat at the center table in a tuxedo that was as dark and silent as his reputation. He was 34 years old, possessed of a quiet authority that some people mistook for passivity. He was not passive. He was the architect of the very floor beneath Hae-rin's heels. He had a stillness about him that came from owning everything the eye could see, and a patience that came from knowing exactly when to let a trap spring. He didn't look at his wife. He looked at the shadows behind her, where 20 men in suits stood ready to remind the room who the real chairman was. Han Jae-won did not flinch when the champagne flute shattered against the Italian marble, sending a spray of crystal shards and vintage brute across the toes of his hand-stitched Oxfords. He remained seated in the velvet armchair, his legs crossed loosely, his hands resting on the armrests with a terrifying sort of ease. Around him, the $100M Gala, a symphony of gold, leaf, and ego, had ground to a stuttering halt. The string quartet's melody trailed off into a discordant scratch, and the air in the ballroom grew thick with the metallic scent of expensive perfume and sudden, sharp scandal. Towering over him, Yoon Hae-rin was a vision of controlled elegance gone wild. Her shimmering gold gown, which usually signaled her status as the queen of the social register, now looked like armor on a woman losing a war she hadn't realized she was fighting. Her chest heaved, the diamond pendant at her throat catching the frantic rhythm of her pulse. Her finger, trembling with a mix of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated vitriol, was pointed directly at Yi-won's eyes. "Do you hear me, Yi-won?" Her voice lashed out, no longer the melodious lilt she used for donors, but a jagged, ugly sound. "This is the end of the road for a parasite like you. I am the reason you breathe this air. I am the reason you're even allowed to sit in a room with people who actually matter. Security." She turned her head, her sharp features twisting as she scanned the perimeter for the men in black suits. To the onlookers, Hae-rin looked like a woman taking back her power, finally discarding the boring, quiet husband she had carried like a heavy coat for years. They saw a powerful socialite asserting her dominance. But Yi-won saw something else. He looked up at her, his eyes calm and observant, carrying that deep stillness that Hae-rin had always mistaken for a lack of ambition. To her, his silence was a void. She never understood that it was actually a reservoir. He watched the way her jaw tightened and the way she played to the crowd, her loss of composure acting as a frantic mask for her own growing insecurity. "Hae-rin," he said, his voice low and steady, a sharp contrast to her screeching register. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even an argument. It was the sound of a man knotting a predictable weather pattern. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, but a gala is a terrible place for a tantrum. People are starting to stare at the cracks in your foundation, not the gold on your dress." The insult hit her harder than a physical blow. Her eyes widened, her face flushing beneath her evening glam. "My foundation," she hissed, leaning in so close he could see the slight smudge of her bold lipstick. "I am the foundation, and tonight I'm removing the trash. Guard now." She snapped her fingers toward the nearest man in a suit, a broad-shouldered figure standing near the marble pillar. She expected a hurried scramble. She expected him to be dragged out into the night, humiliated and broken. Yi-won simply tilted his head, his gaze shifting past his wife to the shadows where the men stood like monoliths. He didn't look like a man about to be evicted. He looked like a king watching a play he had already seen a dozen times, waiting for the final act to begin. The authority in the room hadn't shifted toward her screams. It was anchored right where he sat, silent and immovable. Yoon Hae-rin believed in the power of the spectacle because, for her, the surface was all that had ever existed. She lived her life in the reflection of others' envy, a woman who had meticulously crafted an identity out of high thread count lies and calculated alliances. To Hae-rin, the $100M Gala wasn't just a charity event. It was a coronation, the final stone in a fortress she had been building since the day she met Han Jae-won. She looked down at him now, her eyes flickering with the same hungry ambition that had driven her to spend the last decade systematically erasing his presence from their shared life. She remembered the early years, the quiet dinners where Jae-won would listen more than he spoke, his steady gaze providing a foundation she mistook for a void. Back then, she had viewed his lack of public bravado as a defect, a social handicap she had to compensate for with her own brilliance. While he worked in the shadows, as she called it, Hae-rin had mastered the art of the room. She learned which palms to grease, which scandals to whisper, and how to wear a designer gown like a weapon of war. She had convinced herself that Jae-won was merely a passenger on her ascent, a ghost in the background of her glittering success. Her greed was not merely for money, though she craved the weight of it, but for the absolute control of the narrative. She had spent years quietly diverting their joint assets into accounts only she could touch, gaslighting Jae-won into believing their financial health was entirely dependent on her social maneuvering. She had cultivated a wicked circle of elite friends who fed her ego, women who laughed at Jae-won's simple nature while sipping wine he had technically paid for. Hae-rin had become so intoxicated by her own reflection that she began to believe the gold she wore was hers by divine right, rather than by marriage. This was why she felt so safe shamming him tonight. In her mind, she had already won. She had the connections, the loyal security team she had vetted herself, and the public's adoration. She looked at Jae-won's seated, silent form and saw a man she had already defeated, a relic of a past she was ready to burn. To Hae-rin, power was noise. It was the ability to point a finger and watch the world move. She didn't understand that real power, the kind Jae-won held, was the silent force of the tide, unseen until it was too late to swim. She stood there in her shimmering gold, a monument to her own vanity, blissfully unaware that the room she thought she owned was actually a cage, and the man she was mocking held the only key. To the elite world that Hae-rin courted, the men in black suits were merely background noise, expensive wallpaper designed to keep the riffraff at bay. She saw them as commodities, muscles she had vetted with her own hands and paid for with her own signature. But Hae-rin had never truly looked at them, and she certainly had never looked at Jae-won's past with the same scrutiny she applied to her own social climbing. If she had, she would have realized that while she was busy mastering the art of the gala, Jae-won was mastering the art of the sentinel. Jae-won's empire did not exist in skyscrapers or on stock tickers. It existed in the shadows, in the hushed frequencies of encrypted earpieces, and the unwavering discipline of men who knew how to die for a cause. Years before Hae-rin ever practiced her first fake smile, Jae-won had been building the Vanguard. It started in the wake of his own family's betrayal, a realization that in a world of predators, the only safety lay in being the one who controlled the gates. He had personally trained the first generation of his security force in the harsh, cold mountains of the north, teaching them that true power wasn't about the gun you carried, but the man you served. He had built a global network that provided discreet assurance to the world's most powerful figures, yet he had done it all under a labyrinth of shell companies and proxy directors. To the public, he was a ghost. To his wife, he was a quiet husband who spent too much time on administrative hobbies. He had purposely allowed Hae-rin to believe she had handpicked the security for this very gala, feeding her the profiles of his most elite operatives through a third-party agency she thought she controlled. Every man standing in that ballroom tonight, from the stone-faced guards at the velvet ropes to the lead operative standing 5 feet from her, was a graduate of Jae-won's academy. They were men whose loyalty had been forged in fire, and every one of them drew their salary from a private account linked to the very man she was currently insulting. Hae-rin, silent threat, wasn't a danger lurking in the dark. It was the very floor she stood on. As she screamed for them to remove him, she was unaware that these men were not looking at her for orders. They were watching Yi-won's hands. They were waiting for a single, microscopic nod from the man who had given them their purpose, their pride, and their paycheck. Yi-won had spent a decade building this invisible fortress around his life, creating a world where he could be completely surrounded by his own power while remaining entirely invisible to the woman sleeping in the bed next to him. To Yi-won, the guards were not just employees. They were a living testament to his grandmother's old saying, "The most dangerous lion is the one you walk past every day without ever knowing it's hungry." The shadows were no longer just a place to hide. They were an army, and tonight, they were finally stepping into the light. Hae-rin's aggression at the gala was not a sudden explosion of temper. It was the final, practiced movement of a predator that had been circling its prey for months. In the weeks leading up to this night, she had held her own secret assemblies in the dimly lit corners of exclusive hotel lounges and behind the tinted glass of her private sedan. These were the web of the wicked meetings, sessions where she sat with high-priced attorneys who specialized in destruction and friends who viewed marriage as a corporate takeover. She had meticulously laid out a plan to not only leave Yi-won, but to ensure that when he walked away, he possessed nothing but the clothes on his back and the humiliation of his defeat. She had stood before her mirror many nights, practicing the look of the grieving, betrayed wife while her mind ran through spreadsheets of assets she intended to seize. To her legal team, she had painted a picture of a man who was a financial drain, a quiet burden whose lack of career drive was a form of emotional negligence. She had successfully diverted a significant portion of their liquid assets into offshore accounts under her maiden name, laughing with her confidence over how easy it was to steal from a man who never checked the mail or questioned her spending. "He's too simple to notice the floor is being pulled out from under him," she had told Renee, her closest ally in the plot, over a glass of vintage Bordeaux. "By the time he realizes he's falling, I'll own the building he's falling from." Her meetings weren't just about the money. They were about the absolute erasure of Yi-won's dignity. She had coordinated with a tabloid journalist to ensure that the moment she served him, the story of his infidelity and financial incompetence would hit the wires, effectively blacklisting him from any future social or professional circles. She wanted him impoverished, not just in wealth, but in spirit. She viewed her marriage as a cocoon she was finally ready to shred, believing that she had successfully siphoned every ounce of value from his life to fuel her own. As she stood in the gala ballroom now, the weight of those months of plotting gave her a false sense of invincibility. She felt the heavy diamond pendant on her chest and remembered the meeting where she decided it would be her divorce trophy. She looked at Yi-won and didn't see a human being. She saw a ledger she had already balanced in her favor. Every insult she hurled was backed by the confidence of a woman who believed she had locked every door and boarded up every window of his escape. She was so consumed by the complexity of her own web that she failed to notice the entire structure was built over a chasm. She believed she was a genius of strategy, never pausing to wonder why a man as simple as Yi-won had never once tried to stop her. She mistook his lack of resistance for a lack of awareness, never realizing that he had been a silent witness to every meeting, every wire transfer, and every whispered betrayal. Hae-rin had spent months preparing to divorce him into poverty, unaware that she was the one whose accounts were already empty. The silence in the ballroom had reached a brittle, glass-like tension, the kind that precedes a catastrophic collapse. Hae-rin stood at the center of it, her golden gown shimmering under the chandeliers like a flame that had consumed its own oxygen. She looked around at the faces of the city's elite, the billionaires, the influencers, the old money dynasts, and she saw exactly what she wanted, a sea of wide eyes and hushed breaths. She felt the intoxicating rush of public execution. This was the moment she had rehearsed in the dark, the moment she would finally excise the quiet man from her glittering life and cast him into the gutter. She turned back to Yi-won, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. "You still don't get it, do you?" she spat, the words dripping with a decade of accumulated resentment. "You sit there like you're a part of this world, but you're just a shadow I let follow me around. You're a footnote in my story, Yi-won, and tonight, I'm turning the page." Yi-won didn't blink. He didn't reach for her hand or beg for a private word. He simply sat there, his calm, observant eyes tracking the frantic movement of her pulse in her neck. His stillness was no longer the stillness of a victim. It was the stillness of a cliff face watching a storm break against its side. "Guard!" Hae-rin screamed, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her command. She snapped her fingers toward the lead security officer, a massive man named Marcus whom she believed she had vetted and paid for with the secret accounts she'd drained. "I said remove this man. He is a trespasser. He is nothing. Throw him out and make sure the press gets a good look at him on the way down." She waited for the familiar sound of heavy boots on marble. She waited for the rough hands to seize Yi-won's shoulders and drag him from the velvet chair. She imagined the satisfaction of watching him stumble, his perfectly tailored tuxedo rumpled, his dignity finally as hollow as she believed his bank account to be. The crowd leaned in, 100 phones raised to capture the fall of the silent husband. But the boots did not move. Marcus, the head of security, remained exactly where he was, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on a point just above Hae-rin's head. He didn't even look at her. The other guards, positioned like iron statues around the perimeter of the $100M Gala, didn't flinch. It was as if she had suddenly started speaking a language they no longer understood. "Are you deaf?" Hae-rin shrieked, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. She marched toward Marcus, her heels clicking like gunfire. "I am the one who hired you. I am the one who pays your salary. I gave you a command. Drag him out of here now." For the first time in 10 years, a flicker of something new appeared in Yi-won's eyes as he watched his wife lose her grip on the reality she had manufactured. It was a cold, sharp pity. He finally stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye in the room. The silence deepened until the only sound was the soft hum of the ventilation system. "Hae-rin," Yi-won said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the ballroom. "You should be careful when you give a final command. You might find that you're the only one listening." Hae-rin's laughter was a sharp, jagged sound that grated against the heavy silence of the ballroom. It was the sound of a woman clinging to a cliffside with only her arrogance to hold her up. She looked at Marcus, then at the line of stone-faced men in earpieces, and finally back to Yi-won, who was now standing with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. "You think you've won because they're hesitant," she hissed, her face inches from his. "They aren't listening to me because they're waiting for the police I called to arrive." "You're done, Yi-won. You're a ghost in a suit." She snapped her fingers again, a desperate, frantic gesture that looked like a bird twitching in a snare. "Marcus, I am the client. I signed the contract with Vanguard Security. Do your job and remove this man." Marcus, a man who had seen the inside of war zones Hae-rin couldn't find on a map, finally moved. But he didn't move toward Yi-won. He took a single, synchronized step forward, his boots hitting the marble with a heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the building. As if on a silent frequency, every other guard in the room, 30 men positioned like pillars of iron, stepped forward in unison. Hae-rin's smug expression flickered. She expected a struggle. Instead, she saw Marcus turn his back to her. With a precision that was both beautiful and chilling, Marcus snapped his heels together and inclined his head. Then, slowly and with absolute reverence, he bowed. He didn't bow to the gala organizers, nor to the glittering socialites, and certainly not to the woman in the gold dress. He bowed 90 degrees to Han Jae-won. Across the room, the ripple effect was instantaneous. Every guard at the doors, every man by the velvet ropes, and every operative in the shadows followed suit. A forest of black suits bent forward in a synchronized display of ancient, unwavering loyalty. "The perimeter is secure, Chairman," Marcus's voice boomed, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and silencing the last of the whispers. "The external protocols have been engaged. No one enters or leaves without your direct authorization." Hae-rin felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been struck. Her hand, still raised to point at Yi-won, began to shake violently. The gold fabric of her sleeve rustled in the absolute stillness. "Chairman," she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "What are you talking about? I hired you. I vetted you." Yi-won reached out, his hand moving with a slow, predatory grace. He didn't touch her. He merely adjusted the lapel of his own jacket, smoothing out a wrinkle that only he could see. "You vetted the agency, Hae-rin," he said, his voice as cold as the deep ocean. "But you forgot to ask who built the agency. You forgot to ask why the most elite security force in the world has a name that translates to Silent Watcher in my grandmother's dialect." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the amusement was gone. In its place was the iron-hard reality of a man who had allowed his wife to play at being queen only to see how she would treat the subjects. "You didn't hire them to protect me from the world," Jae-won said softly. "I hired them to protect my world from you." The realization hit Hae-rin like a physical wave. The vanguard she thought she commanded was his private army. The men she had treated like servants were his disciples. She looked around at the bowing guards, realizing that the room wasn't a stage for her triumph. It was a courtroom for her judgment. The gold on her dress suddenly felt like lead, pulling her down into the realization that she was the only person in the $100M Gala who was truly, utterly alone. The oxygen in the ballroom seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity that made the chandeliers look like jagged ice. Hae-rin stood frozen, her pointed finger now a trembling mockery of the power she thought she wielded. The sight of 30 elite operatives bowing to her husband was a visual dissonance her mind refused to compute. She looked at the guests, the titans of industry she had spent years trying to impress, and saw their expressions shifting from shock to a terrifying, sudden realization. They weren't looking at a charity case anymore. They were looking at the sun, finally realizing they had been orbiting him all along. Jae-won didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stepped toward the main stage, the crowd parting like a silent, retreating tide. With a slow, deliberate grace, he reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, unassuming remote. With one click, the massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered to life. They didn't show the charity's logo or the planned promotional video. Instead, they displayed the foundational charter of the $100M Gala itself, alongside the legal structure of the HJW Global Trust. "You told everyone tonight that you invited me here as a gesture of pity, Hae-rin," Jae-won said, his voice echoing with the weight of absolute truth. "You told your lawyers that I was a passenger in your life, a man with no assets and no future, but you never bothered to read the fine print of the world you live in." The screens scrolled through a list of acquisitions, the very land the gala sat upon, the hotel group that managed the service, even the charitable foundation that the guests had been donating to all evening. Every single entity was a subsidiary of a private holding company, Nanabia International, wholly owned by the man Hae-rin had just tried to throw out. "I am not a guest at this gala," Jae-won continued, turning to face the room. "I am the architect of it. This foundation exists because I willed it. This building stands because I bought it. And every single person in this room is here because my office approved their invitation." Hae-rin felt the floor tilt beneath her heels. The web of the wicked she had woven, the siphoned accounts, the secret divorce filings, the carefully planned social assassination, crumbled like dry ash. She had spent months trying to divorce him into poverty, never realizing that the wealth she was trying to steal was merely a crumb he had left on the table for her to find. The $17 billion she had dreamed of was only the tip of an iceberg she had finally crashed into. The lead security officer, Marcus, stepped onto the stage and handed Jae-won a single, heavy folder. It was the original deed to their family estate, the one Hae-rin thought she had successfully transferred to her name 3 weeks ago. Jae-won held it up, the gold seal glinting in the light. "You wanted a public ending, Hae-rin. You wanted the world to see you cast me aside." He looked at her then, his eyes devoid of anger, filled only with the finality of a closed book. "I have spent 10 years building in silence so that my daughters would never have to deal with the noise of people like you. You thought my stillness was emptiness. You were wrong. It was preparation." He dropped the folder onto the podium with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. The wicked wife was now just a woman in a shimmering gold dress, standing in a room she no longer owned, facing a man she had never truly known. The coronation she had planned for herself had become his reveal, and the $100 million stage was now his courtroom. The shift in the room was not a sudden explosion, but a cold, chemical reaction. It was the sound of 100 socialites simultaneously recalculating the value of the woman standing in the center of the floor. For years, Yoon Hae-rin had been the sun they orbited, the gatekeeper of the elite, the woman whose invitation was a certificate of existence. But as the digital screens settled on the cold, hard facts of Yi-won's ownership, that gravity simply ceased to exist. Hae-rin looked toward her closest circle, the women who had sipped her vintage Bordeaux and cheered for her plan to divorce him into poverty. She saw Renee, her most trusted confidant, slowly lowering her phone. Renee didn't step forward to offer a comforting hand. She took a half step back, her eyes darting toward the exit. The wicked circle was already dissolving, its members realizing that to stand near Hae-rin now was to stand in the path of a collapsing building. They weren't just abandoning her. They were erasing her from their contacts in real time. The whispers began, no longer hushed in awe but sharp with the jagged edges of mockery. "She didn't know," someone hissed from the second row, the words carrying easily in the vacuum of the ballroom. "She spent 10 years sleeping next to a god and thought he was a janitor." The laughter followed, a thin, cruel sound that Hae-rin had once directed at others, now weaponized against her. The very people she had weaponized against Yi-won were now looking at her with the clinical pity one might afford a fallen servant. Hae-rin's social power had always been a house of cards built on the illusion of her husband's insignificance. Now that the light had been turned on, everyone could see the cards were blank. The titans of industry, men she had once ordered around as if they were her personal staff, turned their backs on her, moving toward Yi-won with outstretched hands and practiced apologies. They were already pivoting, sensing where the true power lay, leaving Hae-rin in a widening circle of empty marble. She tried to speak, her mouth opening to offer a defense, a command, or even a plea, but her voice failed her. The shimmering gold of her dress, which had felt like the skin of a goddess only moments ago, now felt heavy and garish, the costume of a pretender who had finally been unmasked. She looked at Marcus, the head of security she thought she had vetted, and saw only a wall of black suit fabric. He wasn't her guard, he was his sentinel. The social assassination she had planned for Yi-won had backfired with a precision that was almost artistic. She hadn't just lost a husband, she had lost the world she lived for. The $100M Gala, her crowning achievement, was now the site of her public execution. As the crowd's attention fully transferred to Yi-won, the silent man who was now the loudest presence in the room, Hae-rin realized the most terrifying truth of all. In a room full of people she had spent a lifetime trying to own, she had become completely invisible. The recalculation was over, and her value had been set at 0. The chaos of the evening, the shouting, the shattered glass, and the frantic recalculations of the social elite began to settle into a new, heavy equilibrium. Yi-won did not move with the hurried energy of a man who had just won a fight. Instead, he moved with the slow, rhythmic grace of a man who had finally stepped into a suit that had always been tailored for him. He stepped down from the stage, his footsteps silent on the marble, yet every person in the $100M Gala seemed to feel the vibration of his movement. He walked through the center of the ballroom, and the crowd did not just part, they retreated, creating a wide, respectful corridor of silence. Hae-rin stood at the edge of that path, her golden dress now looking like a discarded costume. She reached out a hand, a reflexive, desperate ghost of a gesture, but Yi-won did not look her way. He didn't need to ignore her, she simply no longer occupied the same plane of existence. The wicked wife had become a shadow, while the husband she had tried to shame had become the light. As he walked, Marcus and the line of black-suited bodyguards moved with him, a silent vanguard that flowed like a dark river through the gold and white opulence. Yi-won stopped near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city's skyline, a skyline he had helped shape from the silence of his private office. He looked at the reflection of the room in the glass, the bowing servers, the nervous billionaires, and the daughters who stood near the entrance, watching him with wide, knowing eyes. For them, he had maintained the stillness. For them, he had allowed the world to think he was nothing so that they could have everything. Real power, Yi-won realized as he watched the city lights flicker, was not the ability to scream or the capacity to humiliate. It was the ability to be the most important person in a room for 10 years without ever needing to say a word. It was the quiet strength of the ground beneath a building, unseen, unthanked, but entirely responsible for the heights reached. He turned back to the room one last time, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had stayed and those who were now scurrying toward the exits in shame. He saw the web of the wicked for what it was, a brittle thing that could not survive the dawn. With a small, almost imperceptible nod to Marcus, the final protocols were closed. The gala was over, but his era had just begun. He walked toward his daughters, his face softening into the only genuine expression of the night. He reached out, taking their hands in his, and led them toward the private exit. He did not look back at the gold, the chandeliers, or the woman standing frozen in the wreckage of her own greed. He had spent a decade building in the shadows, and now, as he stepped out into the cool night air, the silence was no longer a mask. It was a victory. The ground had spoken, the truth had opened, and Han Jae-won was finally, perfectly, at peace.